Welcome to The Kill File, your favorite true crime podcast. I'm your host, Brittany Spears. Each week, we will explore the dark corners of true crime, unsolved mysteries, and murder. Join me as we uncover secrets, investigate evidence, and dive into the chilling details of some of the most fascinating cases. Get ready for a journey into the dark unknown, because in The Kill File, nothing stays buried forever. Hey guys, welcome to episode 39 of The Kill File. I am so glad that you guys are here for another episode. Before we jump into today's episode, I just wanted to give a reminder to find us on your favorite social media platform for extra pictures each week. We are on TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, X, and Blue Sky. Also, don't forget to follow us on whatever platform you are listening on for weekly episodes every Monday. If you are interested in helping out The Kill File, don't forget to click that download button. One last thing, thank you to everyone and anyone who has shared the Kill Files info either on their social medias or in person. I am truly thankful for each and every listener I have. I wouldn't be doing this without you there. Okay, that's it for business. Let's talk about today's case. We are going to cover a serial killer from Belgium who at the time rocked their nation with their crimes. Today we are covering Marc Dutroux and his disgusting crimes. Trigger warnings for today are rape of a minor, sexual assault of a minor, kidnapping, talks of crimes against children, including torture and murder. This guy sucks. Here we go. Marc Paul Allen Dutroux was a man born on November 6, 1956 in Excel to his parents Victor and Janine, who were both teachers. Marc's parents immigrated to the Belgian Congo and then back to Belgium, and when Marc Dutroux was 15, his parents divorced, and Marc went to live with his mother. Marc was the oldest of 5 kids, and in one source it was said that his parents beat him. His mother was said to be very dominant, while his father was allegedly aggressive, so there was a hostile environment in his household growing up, which definitely played some role into his personality later on. He quickly left to venture out on his own after having what was said to be a strained relationship with his parents. According to BBC News, Dutroux, soon after leaving his mother's home, had become a drifter and allegedly a sex worker for men. By the age of 26, Dutroux would find himself married with 2 children. Marc Dutroux married a woman named Françoise Dubois while he was working as an electrician. His wife at the time alleged that he would beat her and that he had multiple affairs, and so the couple would end up separating by the 80s. Needless to say, Dubois had custody of their 2 children. Dutroux always had a life of some level of criminality. Even as early as the 70s, he would steal car parts before finally being convicted of some more serious crimes. After 1979, Dutroux was convicted of what was considered more petty crimes, and these included drug dealing, assaults, and selling stolen vehicles. It was also said during this time that Dutroux was known to frequent local ice rinks just so that he could bump into girls, and this would serve as an excuse to touch them, which is fucking gross. Dutroux's later crimes would escalate further when he would be known to commit fraud with health insurance, investment fraud, and other shady dealings with stocks. I don't believe that he was caught for any of this, and he would then go on to start shipping luxury cars that were being stolen from Belgium, and he would ship them to places like Hungary and Czechoslovakia. Because of this lucrative business, Dutroux was able to buy multiple houses, actually 7 different properties, and these were all in and around the city of Charleroi, located around 45 miles south of Brussels. One of the women that Dutroux was having an affair with would end up being his second wife, and one of the people who was named as a later accomplice to his disgusting crimes. This woman was a teacher whose name was Michelle Martin, 23 years old, and together the couple would end up having 3 children of their own. During the time that Dutroux was having an affair with Michelle, so he was still married to his first wife, Dutroux would commit his first proven kidnapping of a young girl on June 7, 1985. Sylvie D. was just 11 years old when she was abducted by Dutroux and one of his accomplices named Jean Van Petegem. This would be just the first of what would be 5 different kidnappings and sadly rapes against young girls that would span across the year of 85 through 86. Dutroux would be found guilty for the crimes against the 5 girls and sentenced to 13.5 years in prison. His accomplice, Jean, was given a 6.5-year sentence, and then his mistress, Michelle Martin, would be given a sentence of 5 years. One of the girls who had been abducted, named Maria V., who was then 17 years old, said that there was another man involved who she thought to be about in his 50s, but unfortunately this man was never identified and therefore never caught. Even though Dutroux was sentenced to 13.5 years, he would be released early for good behavior. This fucker only spent 3 years of that sentence behind bars before he was fucking released. This reminds me of the Henrietta Massacre case that we did, and this reminds me of the law that Ivy's grandmother called me about when she was saying that they were trying so hard to get a law passed called Knight's Law, where a person who has crimes against children should have to serve 100% of their sentence before being released, because if you remember the man who committed all of those awful murders, that included the 5 kids that were killed, they were just at a sleepover, he only served like 85% or something like that of his sentence before he was released early, and then he went on to needlessly kill those poor children. Why are these fuckers being let out so early? I do not understand this. I'm sorry, but 13.5 years isn't even long enough for abduction and rape of children? What in the actual fuck? People who commit sexual crimes against children, in my opinion, should be fucking castrated. So, after Dutroux would be let out early for good behavior, he immediately went right back to abducting young girls. Of course he did. Duh. Dutroux was actually released even though the public prosecutor objected, as well as a psychiatrist who said Dutroux was still a danger to the public. His mistress, Michelle, was also let out early after only serving 2 years, and she would go on living beside this monster in what some psychiatrists would say the couple was, as an example of folie à deux. So, folie à deux, for anyone who isn't sure or if the name just sounds familiar from the new Joker movie, means, according to Oxford, a quote, delusion or mental illness shared by 2 people in close association, end quote. In French, the term folie à deux quite literally means shared madness or madness for 2. So, while some people believe that Michelle was actually a victim of Dutroux herself, having met him when she was only 23 years old, others believe that she is just as sadistic as Dutroux himself, and you'll understand why later on. Now, in the year of 1992, Dutroux would start the construction on what would be described as a hidden dungeon in the basement of one of his houses in Marcinelle, Charleroi. From the episode of World's Most Evil Killers, you could see that the dungeon was hidden behind a wall and had a strong concrete door. The cell inside the hidden room was about 7 feet long by 3 feet wide and was just about 5 feet high. This brings us to the first set of kidnapped girls, and this would take place on June 24th, 1995. 50 miles from Charleroi, 2 8-year-old girls, Julie Lejeune and Melissa Russo, were playing together while going for a walk in a place called Grasse Hole Onye. Witnesses would later say that they had seen the girls laughing together and waving at the cars that were passing them on the bridge. Unfortunately, the girls would never be seen again. Since there was no ransom request for the 8-year-olds, it was assumed by the authorities that a predator had kidnapped the 2 young girls and that the predator would most likely kill his victims. No one could have imagined that these poor girls would be kept alive and would be tortured in a dungeon for months. It is said that Dutroux abducted the girls and locked them into the dungeon and, trigger warning, repeatedly sexually abused the young girls and allegedly made child pornography videos of the abuse on the girls. This is just so fucking sick and heartbreaking. These 2 sweet babies were absolutely adorable. Like, when you see their pictures, your heart is just like, oh, look how cute they both are. How this sick fuck could look at these 2 young girls and think anything sexual is just beyond my comprehension. Only just 2 months later, on August 23rd, Dutroux would kidnap his second set of girls, this time a 17-year-old named Anne Marshall and her best friend Effie Lambrix, who was 19 years old. Some sources said the girls were on their way back from a camping trip, and other sources said they had been on their way back home to West End from going out for the night in Blackenberg when they were taken. When friends of both Anne and Effie realized that the girls weren't coming home, they notified Effie's father, Jean Lambrix. Jean said he immediately had thought something was wrong because he knew his daughter, and she always told him and her mother where she was going and who she was going with, and Jean knew this was very unlike his daughter to not call anyone and not show up. The last reported sighting of Effie was around midnight inside of the central train station in Ostend. Jean would go on to say that when they took their concerns about their daughter to the authorities, that the police dismissed their parents' claims and would not make a report. The police told the parents that their daughters probably just went out and would come back on their own. When the girls' friends continued to say that they didn't come back and they had still not heard from them, Jean said that they decided to go to the authorities in Hasselt, which is in Belgium, and this time they took Jean seriously and they started an investigation. This is when they would ask Jean questions about his daughter, and this included whether or not Effie was addicted to drugs. Jean told the police his daughter was adamantly against drugs and there was no way that she would do them. Jean then went on to say that at some point during his daughter's disappearance, he said you start to question yourself on how much do you really know your daughter or loved one? And he found himself wondering if there were things that he had missed, which is so heartbreaking when you start to question your own actions like that. At this time, Anne Marshall's father, Paul, had gone in to see a man named Douglas de Koninck, who was or is an investigative journalist, to see if he could help them find their daughters. Douglas de Koninck said that he could vividly remember when Paul had come into his office begging him to put a picture of his daughter on the front page. Douglas said that he thinks the group of people in his office were sort of laughing at Paul, thinking, quote, "Oh God, this poor man, his daughter is sure somewhere partying with some friends and she will show up in a few days," end quote. You get the sense that Belgium had no idea that men like Dutroux were out there and didn't believe that things like this could happen where they lived. And this group's reaction is just kind of an example of this. It really bothered me to hear that they laughed at this poor dad begging for help with his missing daughter. And even if the girls had been out partying and were fine, which, spoiler alert, that's not the case, obviously this poor father was heartbroken and desperate, and for them to laugh at him is just disgusting. It is believed that an accomplice of Dutroux's, a man named Michel Lelivre, who was described as a puppet dependent on drugs, had helped Dutroux abduct the girls in a white van that was used in various abductions, and Michel also helped keep Anne and Effie in a different location since the dungeon was occupied by the 8-year-olds. It was said that Anne and Effie were drugged and taken to a house in Jumet, which was about 3 miles from the house in Marcinelle, where the 8-year-olds were at the time. It was said that both Anne and Effie were chained to beds, tortured, and raped. Dutroux, with the help of his accomplices, would end up unfortunately murdering the 2 teenage girls. It was said that one of the girls was constantly trying to escape because he kept having to wrangle the girls. This could be part of the reason that he killed the girls. Another one of Dutroux's accomplices, a man named Bernard Weinstein, killed both Anne and Effie by burying the girls alive with what was said to be plastic over their heads. When the bodies of these young women would finally be found and exhumed a year later, Anne had been found gagged with her head sealed inside of a plastic bag with tape. They also found her wrists had been bound with tape, and sadly, her autopsy would reveal that she had still been alive at the time. Both girls were said to be extremely thin. In December of 1995, Dutroux would end up being arrested in relation to the theft of a vehicle, and when he was convicted, he was sentenced to 4 months in prison for the theft. During this time, the authorities had searched Dutroux and his wife Michelle's home in Marcinelle, having no idea just how close they were to figuring out everything. On 2 different occasions, the authorities searched the house and, of course, the basement, but they did not find the hidden dungeon, and along with the authorities was a locksmith there to aid them. During the search, the locksmith actually told one of the officers that he had heard screams, and the police officer told him that they must have just been coming from outside, which is sickening because it was probably Julie and Melissa, and unfortunately, they would not be found. During the search of the home, the authorities had found multiple VHS tapes, and unfortunately, these were not watched until much later on. If they had watched them when they found them, they would have been able to see the developmental stages of the quote-unquote child cage, said Douglas de Koninck. It is believed that had the authorities found Julie and Melissa at the house, then they could have potentially saved their lives. Sadly, both of the 8-year-olds would perish in the child dungeon. It turns out that while Dutroux was in prison for those 4 months, he had reminded his wife Michelle to feed their German Shepherd, but neglected to tell her to feed the 8-year-olds that were in the basement. Julie and Melissa sadly would be allowed to starve to death. By the time Dutroux got out of prison, the girls were deceased. Some people believed that his wife Michelle was maybe afraid to go in the basement, but others speculated that she knew exactly what was going on. How could she not? And she sadistically allowed the girls to die from starvation. Although she was not exactly the producer of such horrendous acts, she lived right alongside of them, and people wondered how she could live with herself. After Dutroux got out from the 4-month stint in prison, he was right back on the hunt for girls. This time, on May 28, 1996, Dutroux would kidnap 12-year-old Sabine Dardenne while she was on her way to school, and he would lock her in the dungeon. It was said that because Dutroux had kidnapped such young girls the first time, and maybe they didn't fit his every sexual desire or need, he then went with the older girls who were too hard to keep in line. So that could be why he settled on the ages for the next two. For the next 3 months, Dutroux was letting Sabine write letters to her parents while she was held captive, and he told Sabine that he was sending the letters to her parents, but he wasn't. He was reading them and using them to try to manipulate the poor girl into forming an attachment with him, but Sabine stayed strong and did not take the bait. I couldn't help but wonder why he would want to form an attachment to Sabine. Was it just her in particular, or did he do this with the others? Also, why did he let Sabine have the hope that her parents were receiving her letters? Was it just mental torture? While Dutroux had Sabine in captivity, he was still hunting for more girls. On August 9, 1996, Dutroux would abduct 14-year-old Laetitia Delhez while she was walking home from a swimming pool in a place called Bertrix. He then brought Laetitia to the same dungeon where Sabine was. It would turn out that the abduction of Laetitia would end up being a huge mistake for Dutroux, and she would unknowingly lead to his undoing. There was an eyewitness that would come forward reporting that they had seen Dutroux grab Laetitia, and they would end up getting a partial license plate from his white abduction van. This is when prosecutor Michel Bourlet would start an investigation into this abduction. This partial plate number was able to give the authorities 20 different names for suspects, and Dutroux was one of the names, which sounded familiar to the authorities. Then an operation called Othello, which was looking into Marc Dutroux, and information was starting to be collected for the investigation. 2 investigators, one named Michel and his partner named Jean-Marc Connerotte, were assigned to the case. There would be a man named Thierry Claude, who was approached by Dutroux, who seemed desperate for money, and this is when Dutroux would ask him if he would want to help him kidnap girls, and Dutroux would pay him for the help. Little did Dutroux know that the man he had just approached to try to solicit help with the abductions was actually a police informant, and he went straight to the authorities. Good for him. Finally, somebody with a moral compass. Michel and his team then planned a raid on all 7 homes that Dutroux owned. On August 13th, over 40 special ops police officers would ascend upon the 7 properties. Around 1 p.m., the prosecutor Michel Bourlet was in his office when Connerotte got the news that they had found Dutroux and his wife Michel inside one of the properties that was located in Sars-la-Bouzière. Sorry if I'm butchering that. And they had also located the white van. It was said that Dutroux had been planning to change out the license plates on the van. At this time, Dutroux and Michel would be taken in for questioning. Dutroux was said to be a master of manipulation. He was able to stay calm during questioning, and he was a good liar. After a lot of questioning the accomplice Michel Lelivre, Belgium authorities had to let him go because he was not with Dutroux when Laetitia was kidnapped. However, that same day, an eyewitness came forward, and this would end up being a neighbor in Marcinelle, said that they had seen Dutroux and Michel Lelivre return late that Friday evening carrying a child in a blanket. This had been a few days since they saw this, which led me to ask why the hell they didn't call the police immediately when they saw these 2 grown-ass men carrying a child wrapped in a blanket. I mean, I'm glad that they ended up coming forward, but this wasn't suspicious to them? Look, if I saw my neighbor carrying a child into his home late into the night, I'm calling the cops on that. Sorry, not sorry, that's fucking weird. Now, Michel Lelivre was rearrested, and this is when his alibi would start to fall apart. Once the authorities knew that it was most likely that Laetitia was in Dutroux's van, he would admit to being in Bertrix, which at first he kept denying. This was progress, at least. Then Dutroux would admit to meeting a young girl who he had been talking to that allegedly told him she was tired of her parents. Are you serious? That's what you're gonna go with? This 14-year-old is walking home from the swimming pool just thinking she's tired of her parents and just happens to meet this grown man in a white kidnapper van, and you're saying that she just said, sure, I'll get in and go with you. What a fucking douchebag. That's obviously not true by any means, but for 1 second, let's pretend that it was. "What the fuck are you doing talking to young girls, you fucking pervert?" Dutroux kept changing his story and tried to make things make sense, and then when things started to fall apart and he finally realized the gig was up, he would confess. He then, inside of the interrogation room, pointed at a picture of Sabine that was hanging up, and he said she has been missing since May. Dutroux finally confessed to some parts that would lead the authorities to the secret dungeon where the police would find Sabine and Letitia alive. Yay! So, on the episode I watched, they showed clips of when the girls were found and released from the dungeon, and they were both crying, and whoever was walking them out, maybe investigators or police officers or whatever, they were just beaming with smiles, seemingly so proud and happy that these girls were found safe and alive. The finding of these two young girls was a huge media event where the press was outside of Letitia's home taking pictures, and I heard someone outside of the window, probably a photographer, saying, quote, "Letitia, smile please, thank you." And it fucking annoyed me. She is not your show pony. Maybe she doesn't want to smile after what she just went through, you asshat. Leave her the fuck alone. Her mother standing next to her was nonstop smiling, probably so happy to have her daughter home. Although she wasn't missing nearly as long as Sabine, I think it was only a few days, I'm sure every minute her daughter was gone felt like an eternity, and I'm sure and I know that the damage was done. When Letitia said out of the window, quote, "Don't you worry, I am doing okay, thank you for helping me, thank you very much," end quote, she looked pale and rough like she had just went through hell, but at least she was home. They also showed Sabine's father was just absolutely sobbing when he was reunited with his daughter after so many months. It was amazing to see the father so full of joy. The media had pointed out that these moments were rare when they get reunited like this. The only person that was allowed to go inside of the dungeon to take photographs was the journalist, Douglas Conink, and he said the experience of seeing it was hard to describe. I'm sure, knowing what was going on in that dungeon, it would be so hard to even step foot in there. The authorities were still questioning Dutroux and were desperately looking for the two 8-year-old girls, Melissa and Julie, who were missing now for more than a year. I'm sure finding the other two girls alive gave many people hope that the other missing girls could be found alive as well. During the ongoing questioning, it was clear that Dutroux, according to Douglas Conink, was playing games with the authorities, all the while knowing that he was going to go down as one of the most infamous criminals that Belgium had ever seen. He was exploiting the situation because he knew he was already fucked. It became apparent to the authorities that they needed to make Dutroux believe that they were invested in his poor me victim story, and they had to stroke his ego, making him feel like he was a genius and so smart for evading the authorities for so long, and that his situation wasn't really that bad. By doing this, Dutroux started letting out information little by little and finally admitted to kidnapping the two 8-year-old girls. Jean-Pierre Adams, who was a part of the questioning team, said once they got confirmation about the young girls, they felt the need to hurry and go fast, not knowing if them finding the girls' location would be a matter of life and death. Sadly, the authorities would find the deceased bodies of both Julie and Melissa in the backyard of one of the houses that Dutroux owned with his wife Michelle. Jean-Pierre Adams said that it was absolutely devastating to find the bodies of the young girls. They had all held out hope that the girls were still alive, and he said that he felt so bad for the parents having to find out that their daughters were allowed to starve to death. This is when Dutroux tried to pass the blame off on his wife, saying that he was in prison while his wife was the one who allowed the girls to starve to death and die. Melissa's mother, Karen Russo, was absolutely horrified that she was not allowed to see her daughter's body, stating, quote, "I begged and pleaded. I went with my lawyer, but they refused. They told me the law did not permit it." She then said she asked them, who's going to identify my daughter then? She was asking who's going to confirm that it's her daughter. That's when she was told that Dutroux had identified her. It dumbfounded Karen. Unfortunately, the autopsy would reveal that Melissa was repeatedly raped over a prolonged period of time. However, there was no DNA evidence, no forensics, and no witness sightings for them to confirm that it was indeed Dutroux or possibly anyone else. Karen then talked about how she had files about the case and said that she knew there were swabs taken of Melissa's body, as it said that there was in the reports, but no one knows what happened to the results. The prosecutor nor anyone else seems to know. This is just part of what the nation of Belgium would see as corruption and cover-ups over this entire investigation. It is so sad for these parents not to have answers that they deserve about their daughters. The parents of Melissa feel that this is just a bigger picture that isn't being shown. There were reports of her daughter being seen in a nightclub that was never investigated, and Karen, as well as others, believe that other people may have had access to Melissa and Julie while Dutroux was in prison for the 4-month stint. More on this alleged cover-up later. The authorities would also find the body of Dutroux's accomplice we mentioned before, Bernard Weinstein, in Dutroux's garden, and it's believed that Bernard had helped Dutroux kidnap both Melissa and Julie. After this, Dutroux would also finally admit to the abduction of Anne and Effie, the 2 teenage girls that he had taken and chained to the beds of another house he owned. The father of Effie, Jean, said it was the information that they had been afraid to find out. Dutroux would then show the authorities to the property that was actually owned by Bernard Weinstein. On September 3, 1996, the authorities would find the bodies of both Anne Marchal and Effie Lambrix. After their autopsies, it would be shown that the teenagers were both buried alive, sadly. On the show that I watched, they showed the fathers hugging during the girls' funeral proceedings, and they were both seemingly sobbing. But the way that they embraced each other was just so touching. Like, nothing held back, and they just understood what the other one was going through, and the way they kind of just held each other and nestled into each other with sadness was just so heartbreaking and so raw. I can't imagine what all of these poor parents have gone through. I've said this before, and I'll say it again, but I think someone losing their child has to be the worst thing that could ever happen to a person. Dr. Elizabeth Yardley, who is a criminologist, said that in her opinion, Dutroux is a textbook psychopath. She stated that people like this aren't emotionally complex, that they often lack empathy as well as a conscience. She went on to say that they sort of operate like robots, only following their own wants and desires. He definitely had no empathy for his victims, and he also had no connection to them in any way. One of the men that was an accomplice of Dutroux was a man named Jean-Michel Nihoul, who was apparently a businessman in Brussels and who was also a pub owner, was said to have met Dutroux while they were both in prison, and they would often meet in the yard and make plans. After Dutroux was arrested, and while the investigation was ongoing into building a case against Dutroux, his wife Michelle and at least one of his accomplices, Michel Lelivre, there were said to be about 20 different potential witnesses that were in some way connected to this large case. They actually died, and there was mysterious circumstances surrounding their deaths. This actually stoked the fires of various suspicions of cover-ups at play, and many people believed the levels that this cover-up reached were astonishing. The man who arrested Dutroux was now a judge, and during the investigation, he urged and appealed to the victims of pedophiles to please come forward and tell the police what they knew to help the investigation. This man, now Judge Connerotte, was somewhat of a hero in Belgium for his catching of Dutroux. One woman who was now aged 33, Regina Lou, was the first of 10 different victims to come forward with information. What brave souls, and good for them. I cannot imagine how hard and terrifying that must have been for them to come forward like that. Regina's story was heartbreaking, to say the least. Regina had told the investigators that since the age of 12, her parents had quote-unquote given her to a family friend named Tony van den Bogart, who was actually given a key to their home. Tony would sometimes take Regina from school and whisk her away for some weekends to attend what was called sex parties. Regina was then again, quote-unquote, given to other men for the purpose of sex that was secretly filmed. She stated the entire operation was, quote, highly organized, big business, blackmail. There was a lot of money involved, end quote. Some of the men that she was able to name drop from her absolutely horrific experiences were what she would say were regular clients, and some of them were judges, a notable banker, and one of the most powerful politicians of the country who was at this time deceased. Regina was able to not only give the authorities names, but she could give details about the districts, apartments or houses that she had been taken to quote-unquote entertain the guests, and sometimes with other children as well. She would go on to tell the authorities that the way they entertained the guests was not just sex, it also involved torture, sadistic acts, and she said even murder. Regina told the authorities the specific places of murders who the victims were, and even the various ways in which they were killed. One of the men that she knew as just Mich was actually Jean-Michel Nihoul, and she said this man was specifically very cruel. She said Mich was known to abuse children in different extremely sadistic ways, and there, Regina said, was also Dutroux. At this time, Dutroux was younger and seemed to be like the side guy who brought the cocaine to these sex parties, and was also said to have brought some girls to the parties and liked to watch them as well. So, first off, let me just say that not only was reading her story about what happened to her absolutely fucking sickening to my stomach, but think about what this poor girl must have gone through at such a young age. It dumbfounded me. How do you move on from all that? How do you become a functioning adult after that kind of childhood? Not only from the standpoint of her parents, like, giving their 12-year-old daughter to some sick fuck family friend who would take her to these sick pedophile parties, but then stacked on top were murders? Like, what? That is so much to unpack. How the fuck is this woman existing? Can you fucking imagine? Can you imagine the confusion of, like, why are these people, my parents, the ones who were supposed to be there for you no matter what, like, you're supposed to have your safe place with them for your whole life, giving you away to some sick fuck? What is that about? I have so many questions. Were they getting paid? Did they get threatened? Even if so, like, what threat would allow this to happen so often? And, like, you wouldn't just take your daughter and fucking run? I mean, I know it's easier said than done if they thought the police were involved in these sick parties, but still, did they even know what he was doing with her? I am just so confused by all of this and just shell-shocked that parents would do this to their own daughter and that this poor young girl had to go through all of that. Oh, my heart. I just want to hug that 12-year-old little girl and tell her how sorry I am that she had to see this side of humanity. Also, why were so many people getting together to abuse little girls? Why is this like a thing for people? What in the actual fuck is wrong with people? These are children, little girls whose innocence is just being snatched away. The pain, both physically and mentally, I cannot imagine. You don't just have a normal life after that. How can you? How can you trust people or authorities? If judges were a part of these parties, shame on them, these sick fucks. Okay, so get this. Not only did Regina come forward, which good for you, girl, I cannot imagine how hard that would be, but then the judge, Connor Rote, who was the judge on the case, but back when everything happened was only the investigator and the guy who was able to make progress on Dutroux's case, was taken off the fucking case as the judge. Apparently, he had attended what was said to be a fundraising dinner that was in support of the victims' families, and then he was accused of being in conflict of interest. When this happened, 400,000 people protested and marched on the Palace of Justice in Brussels. It was said that one of the fathers of one of the children that was murdered, a man named Gino Russo, so Melissa Russo's father, spoke up as the voice for all of the protesters, saying, quote, "It was like spitting on the grave of Julie and Melissa," end quote. Judge Connor Rote was replaced by a brand new judge, and this was actually his first assignment, a Judge Jacques Langlois, which, as shitty as this is, and I hate to admit, I do understand. He was the man who arrested Dutroux, which means he has knowledge that he probably shouldn't for the case, and then with the fundraiser, like, I get it. I hate it, but I get it. But here's the shady shit. So after Regina and others gave their stories of things that had happened, it was said that there was a special team of police officers, and these were the officers who actually interviewed Regina and some of the other witnesses. The police felt that Regina's story had substance, as they were able to match at least one of the murders to an unsolved murder case. One of the officers who had been assigned to re-examine that specific case said they felt Regina did witness the murder because there were some details that only someone who had been there would have been able to give the authorities. What Regina was about to tell the police was horrific, including the death of a girl she called Chrissy, who was just 15 years old. Regina detailed how Chrissy was in some sort of bondage where her throat, legs, and hands were all connected with the same rope. She then said the most horrific part was the more that Chrissy struggled or moved, the more she strangled herself. Regina recounted not only was Nihoul there actively partaking in the murder, but of course, so was Dutroux, although he allegedly just watched. Chrissy, who was actually Christine Van Hesse's body, was actually found dumped in an abandoned mushroom farm in 1984. Regina was able to describe details about the farm that had already been demolished in 1996, but she was able to describe things like hooks on the ceilings, what the sinks looked like in the building, even what the wallpaper looked like. When Officer Rudy Hoskins, who had been assigned to re-examine the details in connection to Dutroux's case because the special team of officers was dismissed on the case, he brought this evidence to Prosecutor General of Liège, Anne Philly. Apparently, she just shrugged. Then, according to Hoskins, she told him that Regina was making it up and that she was a fantasist. Let alone the fact that the man who Regina's family used to let take her, Tony van den Bogart, already admitting to the police about his relationship with Regina, and her own parents already admitting that they had given Tony a key to their home. Why would she make the rest of it up? Ugh, it makes no sense. But there was someone who would be able to corroborate Regina's details of the mushroom farm. Hoskins knew that Regina wasn't a fantasist and wasn't making it up because apparently the son of the former owner of that farm had shown Hoskins pictures of the house and the factory for mushrooms. The son told Hoskins there was no way Regina would have known what it looked like unless she had been there. It was very unique. The judge that was in charge of the investigation into the mushroom factory, Judge Van Espen, was eventually exposed that he had a close relationship to Nihul. It also came out that Van Espen was a lawyer and had actually represented Nihul's wife, yet he wasn't taken off the case, even when it was revealed that Van Espen's sister was actually the godmother of Nihul's child. He was actually the one who ordered the police officers to stay off and out of the case. He only took himself off the case once his relationship to Nihul was exposed. Judge Van Espen, having a close relationship to Nihul, the cruel man who actively was involved in the sex parties, and according to Regina, took part in the murder of Chrissy, all the while Dutroux was watching. So I wanted to share this little bit of side information about one of Dutroux's acquaintances because it really shows the evidence into why Belgium was in such an uproar over this case. The protests over how this case was being handled makes a lot more sense once you understand just how high this cover-up and this corruption might go. It wouldn't be for another 7.5 years that the trials for Marc Dutroux, his wife Michelle Martin, and his accomplice Michel Lelivre would start. The trial would begin March 1st, 2004, as this was one of the largest controversies in Belgium history. Protests broke out from the mishandling of the investigation, and people had lost faith in their system and questioned whether the authorities even had the right people on trial. I'm sure with all of this stuff coming out about the corruption and the other higher-ups involved in the alleged pedophile ring, it's easy to understand why. Dutroux had nearly 250 charges against him. He would plead guilty to the murder of Weinstein, his accomplice, but pled not guilty to the abductions and or the murders of the young girls. Jean Lambrecht, Effie's father, said during the trial that they started pulling out photographs of his daughter, and this is when he had to leave the courtroom. He couldn't look at them, nor did he want to see his daughter in that way. I can't imagine. During the trial, Sabine was now 20 years old, and she was able to testify against Dutroux on how he had repeatedly raped her while she was a prisoner for 80 days. She would then go on to say in an interview that there were people who didn't believe her about what had happened to her and thought that she was lying. And now she finally felt like everyone would know and believe her story. Ugh, people suck. Why the fuck would she lie about what happened to her? Like, she was kidnapped, everybody knew that, and she was being held for a long time. Like, what did people think that he was doing with the girls? Dutroux had fired a few of his defense lawyers, and in the end had at least 3, and all of them were using different defenses. One was saying that Dutroux was just a small part of a Europe-wide pedophile network, and that he was just the guy who kidnapped the girls, brought them to sex parties, and cleaned up the messes. Another was saying that he acted alone, and another was trying to say that he was a psychopath, and that's why he did what he did. Dr. Elizabeth Yardley said that people like Dutroux, psychopaths, aren't mentally ill. They are in fact rational and very aware of what they're doing and the choices they're making. I feel like she was just trying to point out the fact that since they have no empathy or connection, psychopaths just don't care that they're causing people harm. Finally, the jury would find Dutroux guilty on June 17, 2004, and they felt that there wasn't enough proof of a larger party or pedophile ring. Dutroux was given the maximum sentence of life for his crimes. Michel Martin was sentenced to 30 years in prison, and his accomplice Michel Lelivre was given 25 years for his role. Jean Lembrix went on to say that he felt there should have been more justice. He seemed very frustrated not getting to know exactly what happened to his daughter and how she was killed. And then he said that they may never know the details on how his daughter met her end. On August 28, 2012, Michel Martin was released from prison and was said to be protected by the Belgium authorities, which caused a lot of upset. I couldn't find why she was released, but I wondered if she had information on other people who may have been involved. Maybe people higher up? Interesting. Jeffrey Wanzel, a journalist and author, says that Dutroux is in solitary confinement and won't admit to the guilt of his crimes against the girls, even though he had in the past. And many people believe that there are more accomplices as well as more victims. And the number? We may never know. And that, my friends, is the awful, sickening story of Marc Dutroux, pedophile, rapist, murderer, and fucking psychopath. Wow, right? What a case. I think we can all agree one way or another that the justice system failed these poor girls, right? If not from the investigation, but at least from the mere fact that Dutroux was let out of prison early, only serving 3 years of a 13-and-a-half-year sentence the first time he was caught. It really made me wonder if that had something to do with the alleged pedophile ring of people who may be more powerful and were able to pull some strings. What do you think? Do you think that they just fucked up and let him out, or do you think it was more than that? Do you think there was a pedophile ring? I'm back and forth on it. I honestly don't know. It makes sense. I mean, according to Regina's story, there definitely was, and I believe her. I'm sure, if there was, and there probably was or is, what happened to it? Did it crumble? Is it still going? Oh, these poor young girls who have to go through shit like this, it makes me sick. And also, again, what is it with all these fucking pedophile rings? All these people are just okay with the fact that they're all fucking sickos. I don't understand this. How do people like this find each other? Are they just partying one night and they get wasted and they're just like, hey, you know what I like to do? I like to find young girls and do whatever sick shit they can think of. And the other guy's like, yeah, me too. Let's go do it together. I don't understand that. How the fuck is that brought up? I've never in my life had a conversation of weird ass shit like that. And thank God I never have, but I've never met people that even tried to tell me that stuff. I don't understand. I will never understand this kind of human behavior and people's lack of standing up for what's right. All these people who were just on the wayside of this pedophile ring, or if they're helping these people, shame on you. Well, I hope you guys enjoyed this twisted case, and I hope to see you guys next week when we will cover another case here on The Kill File. Stay safe, you guys. Bye. Well, that's it for today, you guys. Thanks so much for hanging out with me and listening to another episode of The Kill File. Don't forget to check out the merch shop either at thekillfile.com and click Shop Merch, or you can visit thekillfile.printify.me/products for some awesome true crime merch. Also, follow along on the Kill File's socials for posts about episodes, pictures about the cases, for updates, and more. We are on Facebook, Instagram, and X as The Kill File, and we are on YouTube and TikTok as The Kill File Podcast. Also, feel free to check out the website at thekillfile.com, where you can learn more about me, your host. You can learn a little bit more about how The Kill File got started, and you can suggest a case right there on the website. Let me know in your case suggestion if you want me to shout out your name if I cover your case. There is contact info on the site as well. You guys have no idea how much I love to hear from you. It makes my whole day. Come back on Mondays wherever you get your podcast fix when we will cover another case on The Kill File, where nothing stays buried forever. Stay safe, you guys. Bye.